Elden Ring is a video game made by From Software in 2022, published by Bandai Namco, for PlayStation 4, various Xboxes if you can tell their names apart, and also for the PlayStation 5 if you happen to live in an alternate universe where the console actually exists, and also the PC but with a catch, which I'll explain later. This video might be the most redundant one I'll ever make because everyone is talking about Elden Ring, but I wanted to talk about it anyway. Elden Ring closely follows the design lineage of From Software's Souls series of action RPGs, a series of games that started with Demon's Souls in 2009, a game that in the middle of the 7th console generation, where most games tried to be more cinematic, was made to be a gameplay-focused title where the story is built around the format and not the other way around. After so many games, Elden Ring finally takes the open world formula and implements it into the Souls formula, while also attempting to evolve the series' combat system. Probably everyone and a cat knows by now that the novelist George R. Martin was involved with the development of the game. From what I understand, he created the background lore and mythos for the game, so if you're a fan of his, don't expect to find the actual plot or story here to be penned by him. Elden Ring is set in the lands between, a mythical fantasy realm. A big important MacGuffin called the Elden Ring has been shadowed, and apparently things are not going so good because of that. These guys called the Tarnished are rising right out of their graves, including you, and apparently they are expected to mend the Elden Ring. In case you didn't know, these games have very minimalistic presentation, in that NPCs generally speak as little as possible, and most background info you need to dig up from the item descriptions, and history and events have to be outright deduced out of environmental details. It's also that the players can reach their own conclusions and fill the blanks themselves with their own theories. You might be tempted to go check out some lore channel on YouTube that tells you what everything is. I can tell you not to listen to talking YouTube heads, especially since I'm also some kind of a talking YouTube entity, but I think the story is much more fun when you find some friends who also play the game and discuss it with them, and see what you can share and figure out. So off you go to challenge demigods who have fallen out of grace, and to explore an enormous game world for an estimated 100 hours. And on your way you might find a bunch of characters who all have their own agendas. Most of these characters, if not all of them, bring you tragedies of love and death, usually having a hard time dealing with how death takes from them what's dear to them, and they go to incredible lengths to avoid that fate, trying to deny nature itself. A question arises, at least for me, is love an abominable force that makes us deny the natural order? Or maybe it's part of the natural order for love to rise to oppose it. It's not like the sadness and destruction caused by all these events are meant to make us think in such a negative manner about love. But much like anything else, love can also be a driving force for destruction. To clarify, I'm not talking about strictly romantic love, but love in a broader, more abstract sense. Love as an opposing force against natural death, causing in turn unnatural death instead, is ironic, but there can also be love that goes beyond death. I could probably go on like this for hours, entertaining myself for a while, but probably boring anyone watching this to an unnatural death instead, so let's move on a bit. Despite all this pondering, out of all the Souls games with Elden Ring, I had the hardest time figuring out the lore and context for what I'm doing. It's not like I ever get the full picture without lots of lore talk, but I felt like I ran into a lot more empty spots this time. For now I'm going to play in the sheer size of the game, as the earlier games were more compact, and the time between lore bits was probably lesser, so it felt like I had more story. It's not like I'm completely clueless either, for some of the more mature characters I did figure out what's going on, but at the very least the most important thing is that I did get something out of it at the end. Even though the union of thematic and surface level elements of the story did not complete itself before me once I was done with my playthrough. So, how's the open world then? FromSoft had a good idea in giving the player a spectral steed, so without breaking the settings rules, you can call a horse right under your ass even while you're moving around, and it disappears as easily. No need to wait for your regular horse to run to you, and then spend 2 seconds mounting it. As such, it's pretty easy to move around. I'll talk about the Sites of Grace more later, but once you find and activate one, it can be used as a fast travel point. You can't fast travel out of a dungeon though, you have to leave first. I'm not a fan of inorganic fast travel options like this, but it's really all you can easily implement in a dystopic setting like this, so I'm willing to forgive the game for it, especially when it helps me cut down the playtime in a game of gargantuan length. But what's there to find in an open world? Besides the possibility of running into NPCs and boss fights, there's a bunch of ruins and dungeons for you to explore filled with treasure. Generally, treasure meant spells or weapons, most of which you can't use in early game due to low stats. You won't use most of the things you find, but it means there's at least a few interesting weapons and spells for everyone. I myself spent most of the game using a sword I found in my first 4 hours. However, you can also find Ashes of War, with which you can change the skill of your weapon. Skills cost focus points to use, but they're also very powerful, so they're worth messing around with and a good incentive for exploration. Besides that, you also mount upgrade materials to make your weapon stronger, which is the best way to increase your weapon damage output in the early game, as stat scaling begins to be more effective at higher levels and with higher weapon upgrade levels only. A lot of the content is pretty interesting. I enjoyed even many of the smaller dungeons, the catacombs in particular, where enemies hide by clinging to walls to ambush you, or if those don't get you, maybe the various mechanical traps will. Facing the danger and exploring every place inside out is fun in itself. There are also medium-sized optional dungeons, but the main story dungeons are relatively massive and filled with interesting layouts that take a while to figure out. There's a lot of vertical design where jumping along rooftops can lead you to more treasure, or even sections of dungeons you wouldn't have found otherwise. In the first main dungeon I probably made 4 loops around the same area while trying to find everything, and still apparently missed a bunch of things. In terms of pure layout, the dungeon design is some of the best in the series. However, it feels like there's a lack of the same obstacle design the previous games had. What I mean is the sort of design where the game mixes enemy types and environmental elements together to create some kind of an obstacle that you need to figure your way through. Something like having to deal with a ranged enemy and melee enemies at the same time while on a narrow pathway, for example. Maybe the design has simplified, or maybe I'm so used to it that it's become simple inside my mind. Most I seem to get is groups of enemies to kill my way through and try not to fall to my death if there's a ledge nearby. There's a sentimental, memorable phase to the open world format. Coming across a new, stunning vista as you cross the next knoll trying to find something of interest. The mythical scale of the divine constructs you come across. Mysterious ruins litter around the land as if they had fallen out of the sky. Elden Ring's world at the very least has imagination. Even if 2 of the larger open world areas in the game are mostly grassland with ruins and forests, it does get more interesting as you get further. With most games I would consider the open world format obsolete, to steal away from the possibility of more intricate design, being a waste of money, time and effort, when something more engaging could be imported instead. Despite my praise, it doesn't actually appeal to me, but I can still see the value of it, because outside the aforementioned aesthetic awe, there's the glamour of the journey itself. As an example, early on into the game I ran into a dragon. It caught me completely by surprise, and its every attack ate so much out of my HP bar that a sneeze would kill me next. I could kill the dragon at that point if I put effort into it and learned its patterns through dozens of deaths, but I decided to move elsewhere. After a few hours of travel, exploring caves, forests and castles, I finally returned to the dragon. By luck I even find an NPC to summon into the battle. After what was possibly a cursor's 6-minute boss battle at most, we finally win. It's not like the battle was particularly hard or anything, but it truly carried that familiar feeling of an RPG adventure, the feeling of progress when you finally cross a high wall. That's the magic of an open world game implemented like this. Elden Ring has been criticized for its lack of guidance, not having any usual open world game features that would lead the player on, like giving hints on how to progress questlines, etc. First off, the game actually does guide you. Certain sites of grace will point you either towards the main story dungeons or the medium-sized optional ones. If the main ones are too difficult for you, follow the light to another direction, level up a bit and come back stronger. As for more direct guidance, it should be perfectly fine for one game among dozens to not help the player at all. The charm of Elden Ring is that you go where you want to go. You may meet NPCs who may give you interesting hints, but it's all perfectly organic. You'll talk to like a person talks to another person, and you'll commit it to memory or write it down if you can't remember. Your guidance is your own curiosity and whatever information your character gets on their hands. It's a method for immersion that can be found with quest logs and dotted yellow lines. To some extent, Elden Ring reminds me of the Gothic games, even though the Gothic games give you much more dialogue, which give you pointers on what exactly is going on in the world. You're still mostly on your own, and the best way to figure anything out, or find anything, is to simply explore. It's the raw, natural struggle of it that makes the experience memorable and engaging. I've been playing these games since Demon's Souls released in 2009, so it's probably not surprising if I say that Elden Ring isn't the difficult game that people claim it to be. Difficulty is subjective, but none of the Souls games deserve the third console game generation hard infamy. Souls games are more about driving the player to be methodical in their approach. If one thing doesn't work, try something else. Build your character into what you're comfortable playing as and try to improve on that. Or go beyond your comfort zone and use every dirty trick in the book to win. Every single time these games release, there's talk about difficulty and easy modes. I think both sides of the discussion are more or less misguided. I think an easy mode is redundant. If you make the enemies less of a threat too much, you no longer have to be methodical in your approach, regardless of how good or a bad player you are. If you reduce it just a little bit, then what's the point of doing so anyway? I think focusing on one mode to make it possible to play for the largest possible player base is a better choice for everyone. Though we should also take into account that I have a stigma against difficulty modes in the first place, and wish every game will try to do anything else with their difficulty design. But that's a discussion that could fill a video of its own. On the other hand, the crowd that thinks half of the game mechanics and features are cheating and you haven't actually beaten the boss of the game if you use them are equally ridiculous, or more so. Everyone can make the experience more difficult for themselves and have fun with it, but it doesn't have to be a badge of honor that everyone should strive for. Elden Ring at the very least attempts to evolve the combat of the Souls games. Some players will find the attempt faint compared to the Sekiro meant, and those who didn't like the limitations of Sekiro will probably enjoy what's here more. If you're not familiar with the Souls combat, it basically works like this. You have a stamina bar which is drained whenever you commit to any physical action. Whether it's sprinting, blocking, dodging, swinging a sword or even casting spells. It's recovered back fast all by itself if you don't do anything that would drain it. Stamina is basically a way to limit the player's moves beyond the enemy's recoveries. This is done so that the player is more vulnerable to enemies, making the combat more tactical. Some people even consider the game is turn-based, which is technically true. When an enemy does an action, you have a limited amount of time to act yourself, all depending on enemy's recovery times, how a hit might stagger an opponent, and so on. Wearing heavy armor protects you from damage better, but slows down your dodge roll and movement speed. In reverse, lighter armor protects you less, but you can move faster and your dodging is more effective. Weapons are also counted into the overall weight, so which weapons and how many of them you have is also a choice to consider. A faster weapon also swings faster than a larger one, but the larger ones deal more damage and usually have more reach. If you take damage, you can still heal it with an Estus flask, or a Crimson flask or whatever they're called now. The mechanic is the same. You have a limited amount of flash charges and drinking one consumes a charge, and these charges can be filled at a bonfire, or a Site of Grace as they are called now. Flasks are basically your room for mistakes. Sites of Grace can be misleading for some, as they consider them to be the save points of the game. It's classic console JRPG logic that's easy to apply here, if that's what you're used to, but they're actually the checkpoints. If you want to quit your game, simply choose quit from the menu. You'll continue from the exact same spot, so do not stress having to find a Site of Grace to rest at before quitting. Between the dungeons and the open world, these sites have different significance for combat. In the open world, your flasks are refilled if you defeat a group of opponents or defeat a stronger enemy or a boss, so you don't always have to rest. The sites are more points of progress, something you can unlock to return to via fast travel if you need to go somewhere else. Or if you backtrack a bit and die, you don't lose the ground you've covered, but can always teleport to any site, including the farthest ones you've found. In dungeons, they're checkpoints. Between each site is a combat gauntlet. Make enough mistakes and you'll be out of flasks, so resting will be unavoidable. As resting respawns all the enemies too, it becomes a tactical choice. If you're out of flasks, going forward can be risky as you might die. Backtracking and spending your runes, then redoing everything from the latest site on may be safer, but can also take more time and effort. With the dungeons in Elden Ring, the looping design adds another layer to this. You may want to explore that section of the map, but it overlaps with a part that you've already cleared of enemies. Resting may force you to fight those enemies again. You may not even know how far you might want to go without resting at all. You might loop around so many times while exploring that keeping your rest to a minimum can be convenient. It's an interesting part of the dungeon design and elevates the bonfire system further, and it's a part of the game that I definitely appreciate. But what are runes? Runes are your currency and your experience. Killing enemies and bosses earns you runes, and you need them to buy items and spells, but to also level up your character. Each level up increases a chosen stat by 1 point. It doesn't sound like much, but levels will pile up faster than you'll notice once you get into the moment of clearing areas and dungeons. In early game, it can feel like you barely get any runes out of your grapple, but it'll change soon enough. If you die, your runes are left in a bloodstain on the spot. If you die again, that bloodstain and those runes are erased. But if you get back to that point without dying, you can recover your runes. You keep all the items you found when you die, so your only punishment for dying is generally losing a bit of progress you had between two sites of grace. But with the possibility of losing the runes you may have been gathering for longer than that becomes a bigger worry. This system, however, is handy in the way that if you're half decent in the game, clearing your way back to your bloodstain gives you even more runes, which allows you to gain more levels. Whereas better players who die less don't get the same opportunity to earn as many runes, unless they decide to go out of their way to farm them. In the Souls games, farming is really the best way to get runes. Generally you'll get way more runes by progressing through the game, particularly by killing bosses. The player who dies and has to repeat an area is in a sense punished, but at the same time they're also given an opportunity to learn more and get paid for it. Now, what's actually changed in the combat itself? In my experience, your dodge roll has less distance than in previous games, even at the lightest weight class. By Dark Souls 3, boss design in particular evolved into expecting the player to dodge roll into a position from where they have more time to recover and do the next dodge roll, or else they can't avoid certain follow-up attacks. Elden Ring follows the same idea. Shorter roll range forces high precision. This is obviously to make the game more challenging. I find it counterproductive though. Now I'm more concerned with the iframes of my dodge rather than the animation itself. There are weapon skills that you can use to dodge farther, but their use is limited. Blocking has also received a buff and a nerf. Now when you block a hit, you can follow it up with a heavy counterattack that not only deals plenty of damage, but also can stagger the enemy easier. The price is a heavy loss of stamina though, and using it effectively requires good stamina management. The nerf on shields, however, is that blocking attacks drains far more stamina now, so if an enemy decides to pull a 7-hit combo on you, you're going to want to avoid the first few blows by somehow distancing yourself from your foe. These changes make the player feel far more vulnerable. Early game can give you a really tough time, especially if this is your first Souls title. The player does get a couple of advantages. The first is the staggering mechanic. There's basically a hidden value on every enemy which increases as they're hit. Heavier attacks increase the stagger value better, and when it reaches a certain point the enemy is staggered, allowing you to deal a critical attack on them for large amounts of damage. This was the core of combat in Sekiro, except in that game, staggering was achieved by deflecting attacks, and attacking the enemy in turn in an attempt to unbalance them. Somewhat related to stagger are jump attacks. The player can now jump properly vertically, without any sprinting wind-up. Jumping is a defensive tool just as it is an offensive tool, something that was also part of Sekiro combat. Horizontal attacks that aren't too high can be jumped over, and while you're midair you can choose to pull a light swing as you fall down, or to smack your enemy on the head with a heavy blow. The heavier jump attack deals plenty of stagger damage, while being one of the best damage dealing moves in the player's arsenal overall. Staggers and jump attacks, combined with the weaker dodge and block, are possibly ways to encourage players into more aggressive play. It's an interesting change, but can also be jarring for some players. I'm once again repeating that I didn't find the game particularly hard. I did die a lot of course, but most of my deaths were both surprisingly and unsurprisingly caused by gravity, especially when I decided to commit to doing a job that's not mine, which is looking for ledges that very much look like you can jump on them and not die. Only to die instantly when you try. However, for the weapons that I tried at least, there's a limit to how many regular attacks you can combo. So your basic attack combo is no longer limited by stamina as much as it is by simply placing a longer recovery between every few attacks. It could simply be a change made for the sake of PvP, but limiting the player's ability to keep enemies in a stagger lock in a game where you're already more vulnerable and enemies seem to have more HP and defense in general feels like a nerf on top of a nerf. The way the game tries to be more challenging, more demanding, is not very imaginative, particularly when the game is more combat oriented than obstacle oriented in its design as I mentioned before. It also feels like enemies, particularly in late game, love to attack quickly, recover rather fast and then jump 2 meters away. If you're used to countering enemies with your attacks and expecting your character to move forward enough to reach your opponent, you're now going to miss a lot of swings. It's more reliable to chase your enemy down or do a sprint boosted jump attack. Enemies still do have specific attacks which leave them open for longer. Adapting to the changes in overall combat and enemy design is necessary, and if you refuse to do that and stick to the way you've played in older Souls games or other action RPGs for that matter, you may be in for a world of pain. Elden Ring does offer more tools than smashing your enemies to bits in a calculated aggressive manner. There's always magic, which is the same thing but from a distance. It requires several point investments to make effective, and you also have to find or buy any spells you want to use. I didn't use magic myself, I rarely use magic in these games. Some players find themselves using the same spells too much because they're simply most effective, but there's also plenty of crazy spells to play around with. Unfortunately, I can't guarantee you'll get great mage gameplay out of the Souls games if that's what you want, but using a mage is still always an option. Like in Sekiro, now you can also squat down to sneak. Enemies can't hear you at all like this if you're not in their sight, with some exceptions. I did have to change my control so that the default button for sneaking, which is pressing down the movement key, was changed to spell select instead, and mapping the sneak button to D-pad up. I kept pressing the button while fighting bosses, and constantly going into sneak mode by accident, which makes your dodge roll cover even less distance and causing me to die constantly. Sneaking has its uses. Not only can you avoid fighting some enemies if you have no reason to fight them at all, but hitting an enemy with any attack, including a backstab, when they haven't aggroed yet, will deal extra damage. Again, similar to Sekiro, you can use this to kill or reduce the HP of the strongest enemy in the group, to have an easier time when the rest notice you and attack you. Or if you pick your fights right, and maybe use some other tools to lure enemies around, you can take several out slowly but calculatively, by sneaking to an isolated enemy, killing them with a backstab, then quickly retreating to the nearest bush to avoid being noticed. Maybe even managing to lure in another victim with a little noise the assassination may have caused. Practically everything in the game has lost its mind, so enemies don't even care if they fight a body, but some enemies will commit to the duty they had in life and will alert their former unit with a horn if they happen to see you. So alerts are still part of the game in a way, but the overall AR on sneaking is slightly less complex than in Sekiro, as far as I can remember. Besides melee and magic, you have bows. Bows still feel pathetic in these games. When you shoot an arrow it flies at such a slow speed, and most of the time barely deals significant damage. It's more of a way to lure enemies to you to more easily divide and conquer them. There are some cool bow skills, one of which fires arrows much faster, but their animations are slow, so I'm not very impressed. Besides bows, there are more tools. Tools that you can make by crafting, like throwing knives, which can be used to inflict status ailments on your opponents. They're hard to hit with though. You can also make those good old firebombs to set enemies on fire. What you can craft expands as you find manuals in the game world, which is another incentive for exploration. The system is very basic. You will need some materials to make certain items, and once you have them you can make it. Some of these drop off enemies or wild animals, but most of them can be picked up from the wilderness. The crafting system is handy in that you don't have to amass a pile of runes to go buy yourself a pile of arrows or bombs. You can simply make them. But if you haven't happened to gather a pile of materials that are needed for certain items, going back to a certain location just to find them can be jarring. I tried to make my character utilize some of these tools, but they were rarely effective. Although they did help me out in some situations. Melee was still the best choice for me, especially dual-wielding great swords and jump attacking everything to death. This trick is obviously not effective against absolutely everything, but it still works so much that it invalidated most of my options, making me even abandon shields almost completely. The point isn't that you should dual-wield great swords to play the game most effectively. It probably isn't even the best strategy, probably far from it. But just like any RPG, Elden Ring isn't balanced, and many of the things you will try will not help you much, while something else will become a cookie cutter. It depends on the player what their cookie cutter is, which is one of the joys of RPGs. So this isn't as much a criticism towards the game, as it is a warning to someone who wants to play it. I did not participate in the online play. I've had my share of Souls multiplayer already, and I'm frankly sick of the PvP. As such, I can't go into detail about the PvP in Elden Ring, but for those unfamiliar, the multiplayer in these games is an invite and invade type of system. A player can summon other players into their own game to help them. Besides the runes they may earn from the session, those helpers won't progress their own game at all. Online sessions are typically limited within a dungeon or a general area, and the session ends when the boss of the area is defeated or the host dies. Invaded players try to hunt down the host before they can reach a boss. The biggest change in Elden Ring is that the player can't be invaded by other players unless they've summoned help, so it's always a 2v1 situation. The invader doesn't have to worry about enemy monsters like his prey, so the environment and mobs can be on their side if they know how to make use of the situation. But that's only fair on paper and not necessarily in practice. People can be invited for 1v1 duels as well if you want a honorable match. Elden Ring is a beautiful game. It could be even more stylish in my opinion, but it definitely has a strong art direction. Atmosphere is not only boosted by the visuals but the music as well. Personally, I find the music too ambient and even generic to a degree. It's not badly made, but I want something more out of video game music. Especially when FromSoft has incredible composers at their disposal, who have made very unique and memorable soundtracks for their past titles. I can confidently say that I wanted something more different, but at the same time the music is still perfectly functional for the game as it is. The game is available on various platforms which I listed in the beginning of the video. I played and recorded the game on a PlayStation 4. It runs decently if you use the 30 FPS and don't mind some drops here and there. The PlayStation 5 apparently runs the PS4 version much better. Allegedly even better than the actual PlayStation 5 version. But you didn't hear that from me. The PC port is apparently poorly optimized. Completely unrelated to the raw power of your actual rig. You might have the game run with absolutely no issues, or so poorly the game starts de-rendering enemies in front of you. Don't expect them to somehow fix the port unless they someday release a remaster or something. If the game is in such poor condition while the console versions don't have similar problems, there's something wrong with the PC port at the base level that takes far more than post-release optimizing to fix. Speaking of technical issues, some final little things about the game in general that I should bring up. There are a number of bugs or simply weird jank that you may not expect. One of the things that bothered me the most was being able to keep a lock on an enemy while they move behind a pillar or something, but once they're back in your line of sight, the lock on breaks. Both on foot and in mounted combat, if you move down a very short ledge, your animations, including attack animations, will be cancelled by fall animation, unless you're jump attacking. The character animations and movement are not made to handle a deeper step. Another issue I had was NPC quests breaking completely no matter what flags I tried to initiate. But this may be because I started the game before they patched it with quest lines that weren't in the game yet. In the same patch they added a system that allows you to see NPCs on the map, which was partially broken for me. The map would sometimes show NPC locations in places they weren't in, or were not even supposed to be in, and sometimes it would not show the NPCs there at all, even if they were there. It's impressive that the game has plenty of content, but at the same time I feel like this game stole a month of my life, even though my playthrough took roughly 115 hours, not an exact month by minute. Previous Souls titles have stolen more time from my life at release than Elden Ring did, but felt less like stealing and more like I was giving it away willingly. As a player I could put down the controller and move on, but I also play games to explore them as works of art. I always want to finish the game I start because only that way I can see better how it was made and why and where its potential really goes. Elden Ring was the newest game from one of my favorite studios. I'm obligated to play it from start to end and see as much of it as I can. I would prefer the shorter game. I feel like a shorter game could be more intricately designed. A shorter game could fit in more unique boss and enemy design, more interesting and deep combat and RPG mechanics. I'm not going to deny anyone the joy they've had with Elden Ring, after all I did enjoy it too. But just like I enjoy eating cake, I'm a human being and can only eat so much at once. Food metaphors are tiring and often inaccurate and inequivalent, but hopefully this one works enough to get the message across. And to be snarky and maybe anger someone a little bit, I must once again announce that the one true king remains on his throne. David has once again beaten the Goliath. I don't give games scores, but I rate them based on my personal enjoyment level, and I'd rate Elden Ring 8 out of 10 in that regard. In short summary, Elden Ring is an immersive open-world action RPG. A story of love and death you're thrown into with nothing but your wits and skill to help you. A journey that can feel almost endless, both to its merit and detriment. It may not have mercy, but it does have grace. See you again.